start the recording now. But this is the fifth lecture in our program in Indigenous Solidarity and Environmental Justice. The Matarokaya Initiative has several major programs, and this particular lecture series is housed in our Indigenous Solidarity and Environmental Justice program. So the title of this project, the lecture series, We Are Not Immigrants, Unsettling Asians in America, has very much been inspired by both Hawaiian sovereignty activist and professor Haunani-Kay Trask. She has a poem entitled Settler Not Immigrants. And we're also inspired by Native American Studies scholars Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, Not a Nation of Immigrants. And really, what we wanted to do here was to lift up all the ways Asian Americans are resisting settler colonialism in California. Among the things we've done in our lecture series is just to hold space to listen and learn from Native American activists and scholars who do work in the areas where AKI also has programming. But we've also held space to hear from folks who are Asian American identified, who are doing work in actively unsettling and interrogating our relationship to settler colonialism through their activisms and scholarship. So we've held space for folks to do to lead us in discussion and to hear about their various kinds of projects. And so we're able to hear today from Dr. Ryan Buyco. So Ryan Buyco is a assistant professor of ethnic studies at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, California, where he teaches courses in Filipinx, Asian American, and Pacific Islander studies. Dr. Buyco's current book project, Island Under the Sun, Filipino American Detours in Okinawa, is a monograph and travelogue that brings Filipinx and Asian settler colonial critiques to the colonial context of Okinawa, widely known as the Hawaii of Japan. This project is informed by his years traveling to these islands as a Filipino American scholar and doing research on how connections between the Philippines and Okinawa have been represented in works of Okinawan culture. His book project introduces readers to specific places throughout Okinawa that speak to these connections, including war memorials, churches, bars, and narrow roads that can be found beyond the formal bounds of military fence lines. Ultimately, his book project describes how Filipinos have always been a part of the context of U.S. militarization in Okinawa and makes a case as to why Filipinos everywhere should support demilitarization in Okinawa today. Really, really excited to hear from Dr. Buyco, a really nice way to close out our lecture series for this year. We're really, really hoping to be able to bring this lecture series again to you next year. I should say, I didn't get a chance to mention this, that a Matarokaya Initiative has been partnering with the Asian American Seed Stewards led by Dr. Gayong Chung, who was my colleague in the Department of Asian American Studies at UC Davis. We are literally, it was sort of a quick transition, but Anna Pack, who works with us at the Matarokaya Initiative, and I have been working on a grant proposal that is due on the 15th, which we hope will allow us to extend this project. It's been, as you can see today, very well attended consistently across all of the 5 lectures that we've had. Another piece of the overarching project is we have launched an oral history project of Asian, Native American, mixed race community members who are also actually activists and leaders in indigenous struggles here in Northern California. We're really hoping to get some support to fund not just an additional lecture series, but also an in-person symposium and a traveling exhibition based on the oral histories and the artifacts that we collect, that we are actively collecting now. So super excited that you're all here to join us. And I want to hand the mic over now to Dr. Buyco. Thank you so much for joining us, Ryan.
Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. I'd like to thank Dr. Rodriguez and everyone at the Amado Kaya Initiative, especially Angela, but also Anna, for inviting me and organizing this talk, as well as to everyone for coming out today. So like Dr. Rodriguez said, my name is Ryan Buyco, and I'm an assistant professor of ethnic studies at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, where I teach courses in the fields of Filipinx, Asian American, and Pacific Islander studies. My research, writing, and teaching interests, especially in recent years, have been heavily invested in ongoing discussions in Filipinx studies with the question of settler colonialism and indigeneity in the Pacific. For my presentation this afternoon, I'd like to introduce the book project that I'm currently working on as part of this larger series on We Are Not Immigrants, Unsettling Asian America. So it's just an honor for me to be here today and be a part of this ongoing dialogue. So thank you very much again for having me. Also, I think I saw like my family in this talk. So hello, family. I will be home later on today. But before I begin my presentation, I'd like to first acknowledge my own geographical location on the ancestral lands of the Yaktitutitu Yaktilhini Northern Chumash tribe, the indigenous people of the San Luis Obispo County and region. The Yaktitutitu Yaktilhini Northern Chumash tribe, or the YTT for short, have a documented presence in this region for over 10,000 years, representing an unbroken chain of lineage, kinship, and culture. YTT traditional lands include all of the federal, state, and open spaces within San Luis Obispo County and region, which extend east into the Carrizo Plains toward Kern County, south to the Santa Maria River, north to Ragged Point, and west beyond the ocean shoreline. I would also like to point out that Morro Bay, which we recognize as the site of the first landing of Filipinos on the continental United States, is also located on these YTT ancestral lands. Given our own experience of colonization and dispersal within and across the Pacific Ocean, I would also like to recognize our shared responsibilities as Filipinos in the diaspora to confront how our histories are interconnected with the struggles of indigenous peoples on whose lands and waters we call home, as well as travel through. So in this spirit, I'd actually like to share two links with you today. So so I'd like to share these two links, especially given the importance of Morro Bay and Filipinx American history. So the first is the official website of the YTT and their current movement to reclaim part of their ancestral homeland of what is commonly known as Diablo Canyon, located here on the central coast of California. And the second is a link to an article written by my Cal Poly Ethnic Studies colleague, Dr. Lydia Heberling, which contextualizes this issue in relation to California's ongoing quest for clean energy. Please do have a look if you have the time and space later. So today, I'll be talking about my ongoing book project about travel writing, Asian settler colonial critique, and the Filipinx diaspora in the context of Okinawa. And so to open up my discussion this afternoon, I'd like to begin with an excerpt from R. Zamora Lindmark's 2011 novel, Leche, to begin thinking about travel in relation to the mobility of the Filipinx diaspora around the world. And so I'm just going to read it. Oops. Because the soul, sir, it just ends up wandering like it's homeless. But that's part of being Filipino, sir, because we are all wanderers. We're here, we're there, we're everywhere, scattered like the stars. That's us, sir, kalat kalat, even in our sleep. Vince remains quiet, listening intently as Bernadette continues to talk in her sing-song voice, her roll of the R's, her accent thick and lulling, like a mother guiding her child toward wisdom. We are all wanderers, echoes in Vince's head. And whether it included him or not, it is true. Filipinos are wanderers, peregrinators, seafarers, scattering themselves across the world, as Bernadette said, like the stars that first guided them out of Malaysia toward the islands of 1,000 volcanoes, before it was christened by the Spaniards as Islands of St. Lazarus. It is in the blood of every Filipino. It is in their nature and dreams to roam, to seek a better life, to adapt and adopt another country. Migration is at the core of their existence and survival. It is inherent in their history. It is their legacy. Seafarers then, overseas contract workers now, nothing much has changed. The Filipino is still going places, home hopping, tongue twisting. Whether in slippers, shoes, or barefoot, the itchy feet are constantly on the move forward. And when sleep closes the nomad's eyes, the soul picks up where the body leaves off, pursuing and preserving the never ending journey. So, towards the end of Lindmark's Leche, which is a novel about the travels of a Filipino American returning to the homeland, the protagonist of the story, Vince, listens to the sing song voice of Bernadette, a Filipino helper, in this passage here. In this scene, Bernadette describes the Filipino diaspora through the language of wandering, prompting Vince to reflect on travel as an essential part of being Filipino. So Filipinos are wanderers, peregrinators, seafarers, scattering themselves across the world, like the stars that first guided them out of Malaysia towards the islands of 1,000 volcanoes before it was christened by the Spaniards as Islands of St. Lazarus. Vince meditates on Bernadette's words, connecting the legacy of seafarers to contemporary overseas contract workers, noting that not much has changed over the years despite their differing circumstances, that Filipinos are still going places, roaming, seeking better lives elsewhere. The use of kalat kalat in this interaction between Vince and Bernadette is significant. Kalat kalat in Tagalog means scattered and can be used in a variety of ways, which include the description of stars in the night sky, the littering of trash on the street, as well as the dispersal of wildflower seeds in a field. In light of the colonial legacies that continue to compel Filipinos to move around the world, kalat kalat, as it is used in this passage, simultaneously describes the marginalization of Filipinos once they reach their destinations, in the sense that kalat kalat can refer to trash being scattered, as well as the forms of cultural and creative expressions that have emerged from these diasporic experiences. Kalat kalat in the sense of flowers growing in the wild. In Zamora's larger narrative of Leche, references to the archipelago's pre-colonial history and the history of Spanish, American, and Japanese colonization have been folded into Vince's eventual realization that Filipinos have always traveled and continue to travel, and that as a Filipino American in the diaspora, Vince too will also continue this never-ending journey in his own way. So I wanted to begin my talk this afternoon with this reading of Leche to reflect on my own intellectual engagements with travel writing and Asian settler colonial critique from my positionality as a Filipino American scholar to continue, not unlike Vince, this legacy of Filipino travel, but in ways that confront the problems that come from living, moving through, and traveling on indigenous lands. Since the 2000 special issue of the Amerasia Journal and the subsequent edited volume in 2008, Asian settler colonial critique has been a major intervention in Asian American studies scholarship that has revealed the ways that Asians and Asian Americans have been implicated within processes of settler colonialism and indigenous dispossession in the past and the present day. These discussions have been especially important in equipping scholars like myself with a conceptual language to rethink my relationality with indigenous peoples in ways that acknowledges my agency in the face of US empire, while also recognizing the responsibilities I have to the peoples on whose lands and waters I call home, as well as travel through. Um, So the tentative title of my monograph, which I'll be talking about today, is Island Under the Sun, Filipino American Detours in Okinawa, which is a travelogue that brings Filipinx and Asian settler colonial critiques to the colonial context of Okinawa, which has become widely known as the Hawaii in recent years, or Hawaii of Japan in recent years. This project is informed by my years traveling to these islands as a Filipino American scholar and doing research on how connections between the Philippines and Okinawa have been represented in works of Okinawan culture. This book is meant to introduce readers to specific places throughout Okinawa that speak to these connections, including war memorials, churches, bars, and narrow roads that could be found beyond the formal bounds of military fence lines. Ultimately, this book describes how Filipinos have always been a part of the context of US militarization in Okinawa and makes a case as to why Filipinos everywhere should support demilitarization in Okinawa today. So my book's consideration of the Filipino diaspora, but more specifically, my positionality as a Filipino American scholar within this context, is made in light of the ongoing circumstances of US and Japanese colonialisms in these islands, made manifest by the large presence of US military bases. It is important to note that Okinawa, compared to the rest of the Japan, carries the uneven burden of hosting approximately 70% of all US military bases in the country and remains the poorest prefecture in Japan since its reversion in 1972 from US military control. Historically, prior to its formal annexation by the Japanese nation state in 1879, Okinawa was a kingdom called the Ryukyus. At the turn of the 20th century, the Japanese colonial government carried out language standardization policies and other assimilation measures to force Okinawans to become good Japanese subjects. During the Pacific War, Okinawa was the site of the Battle of Okinawa, a major land battle in which a quarter of the population died. In the war's aftermath, the U.S. government seized Okinawan lands in order to build the military bases, many of them remaining to this day. The contemporary circumstances of militarization in Okinawa, in addition to the settler colonial logics that continue to marginalize Okinawans from their lands and waters, must be understood as the co-constitution between US and Japanese colonialisms. As the Okinawan Studies scholar Anne-Maria Shimabuku has pointed out, the very presence of these bases allowed the United States to enjoy their military dominance in East Asia, while Japan enjoys America's protection without the negative effects of the US bases, which include forms of environmental degradation, sexual violence, and other crimes and accidents committed by US military personnel. Furthermore, since Okinawa is a prefecture of Japan and not its own nation state, Okinawans are unable to bring their grievances to the US directly, since the US will only entertain discussions with Japan. Given this limiting geopolitical context, thinking about Okinawa beyond the formal structures of the US-Japan relationship have become important sites of political intervention. Excuse me. So I wanted to begin this context to underscore the stakes of my project, given the ongoing engagements within Asian American Studies and Filipinx Studies scholarship with settler colonialism and indigeneity in recent years. In particular, scholars in these discussions have developed key conceptual tools to reimagine Asian and indigenous relations beyond the limitations of the settler state in order to theorize forms of solidarity with indigenous peoples and their struggles, particularly in Hawaii, North America, and other geographical sites throughout the Pacific. In his essay, Colonial Amnesia, Rethinking Filipino American Settler Empowerment in the U.S. Colony of Hawaii, Dean Cernilio reminds us that the term Filipino emerged in the late 19th century as a form of national consciousness when a large number of natives referred to themselves as Filipinos to resist Spanish colonizers. In his reading of Andres Bonifacio's Pag-ibig sa Tinubuang Bayan, literally love for the country of one's roots, Cernilio contends that identifying as Filipino meant committing oneself to resisting colonial oppression. In other words, redirecting their utang na loob, feelings of indebtedness, from Spain to the anti-colonial movement. Writing in the context of Hawaii, Cernilio argues that Filipinos can be powerful supporters of the Native Hawaiian movement for decolonization, and that our utang na loob belongs to Native Hawaiians and not to the United States because we live on stolen land. Considering this, my project extends Cernilio's argument to the context of Okinawa, especially given how the US bases have historically brought and continue to bring Filipinos to these islands. In the post-war period alone, for example, the Ryukyu Command in Okinawa employed thousands of Filipinos in jobs relating to the construction, maintenance, and operation of the bases. Today, Filipinos still migrate to Okinawa for work, but also go as soldiers or partners of soldiers in the US military. Others, like myself, travel to Okinawa as researchers, students, and tourists. In light of the issues that come with the US bases, the consideration of Filipinos in this context not only emphasize the complicated nature of US militarization, but also gestures to the need to imagine Filipinos in relation to Okinawan struggles for demilitarization, given the Philippines' own colonial relationship with the United States, as well as with Japan. So, in this way, Island Under the Sun contributes to ongoing discussions on what it means to be Filipino on native land, especially in the context of Okinawa, where there are active calls for demilitarization. More specifically, how can a consideration of Filipino and Okinawan relations, as they have been conditioned by the history of Japanese and American colonialisms during the 20th century, help us to address this question? As I mentioned, Island Under the Sun is a travelogue that depicts my own journeys throughout Okinawa as a Filipino American scholar, visiting various places to explore the interconnected histories between these two archipelagos. In particular, my visits to these different sites, such as war memorials, churches, and areas outside the US bases, are informed by my own readings of Okinawan cultural texts, particularly those that meditate on the connections between Okinawan and Filipino people. While I acknowledge that travel writing is a problematic genre given its historical connection to the colonial project, more specifically, what Mary Louise Pratt has argued as travel writing's role in producing the rest of the world to legitimize Western colonization, I argue that travel writing can also carry the capacity to cultivate decolonial forms of relationality in which settlers, potential visitors, as well as armchair travelers can become invested to support indigenous struggles too. So the tentative title of my book, Island Under the Sun, is a reference to the touristic image that frames Okinawa as Japan's Hawaii, which is significant given that in 2018, Okinawa's tourism numbers topped Hawaii for the very first time. Furthermore, the image of Okinawa as a tropical paradise conceals the conditions that displace Okinawans from their lands and waters, not to mention the roles that Filipinos play within this context. So I just want to show you a really quick 2-minute video just to kind of give you a sense of what I mean. All right. So considering all of this, my project really draws inspiration from Detours, a decolonial guide to Hawaii, to disrupt how common tourist imaginaries conceal the ongoing conditions of occupation. So in their description of the detour, an alternative tour in Hawaii, where the authors were led by Terry Kiko Olani and Kyle Kachihiro, Laura May Singh and Bernadette Gonzalez note that visitors are invited to produce new spatial temporal relationships and imaginaries of Hawaii that exceed the fantasies of the islands as a secured paradise. On these detours, participants are brought to pivotal places throughout the island of Oahu, such as Pearl Harbor, where they can learn histories otherwise marginalized, subjugated, or sanitized, which can, according to Ellen Ray Cachola, Tina Grandinetti, and Aiko Yamashiro, become the grounds from which to build more just relationships between indigenous peoples and settlers in the present. In a similar yet different way, particularly from my positionality as a Filipino American scholar, my project offers readers a possible itinerary to explore how the continuities of Japanese and American colonialisms have shaped Filipino and Okinawan relations, to not only intervene in the notion of Okinawa as an island paradise, but to also begin imagining and cultivating new forms of community for the future. So, in terms of narrative, my book follows my journey driving on National Route 58, a road that links the southern area of the island of Okinawa to the north. From the post-war period until 1972, Route 58 was known as Military Highway Number 1, which was built so that American military vehicles could transport materials throughout the island. Today, the everyday use of cars in Okinawa, unlike trains in the rest of Japan, is a legacy of this history. After 1972, when Okinawa returned to Japanese control, Route 58 played an important role in the construction of Okinawa as Japan's island paradise. From the perspective of a car, tourists today can view the beautiful ocean, move through Okinawa's urban center, and survey the shifting landscapes of the island until they finally approach Yambaru, the northern reaches of this place. My travelogue is a narrative of me driving in a rental car, going from the southern part of Okinawa to the north, visiting places to meditate on the connections between Okinawa and the Philippines, and what that might mean to me, as well as to other Filipinos who live in Okinawa or might travel to these islands someday. Um, and I think at this point, I've been just trying to give just a little bit of context on where I'm sort of like situating this project. But I want to talk a little bit more about travel writing generally, and sort of what brings me to sort of, write this project as a travelogue. So despite its colonial baggage, travel writing, at least to me, can be an important form of writing that shares with others about how our journeys, broadly defined, change us, our worldviews, and the ways that we relate to one another. Travel writing narrates such experiences of change through the encounter with other places, the people who live there, and ideas that you would otherwise not have thought about on your own if you stayed. So my journey started in the 1990s when my parents decided to move us out of Stockton, California, where I was born, to a suburb of St. Paul, Minnesota, in the Midwest. So this is just a picture of me on the far left, and then my older sister in the middle, and then my younger sister to the right. So my parents made this decision to leave California because they believed that my sisters and I would have more opportunities than if we stayed in Stockton. Living in Minnesota, however, was a really difficult experience for me, not just because of the cold, but because I had a hard time assimilating there. So Minnesota was the place where I first consciously discovered the feeling of being marginalized for the first time. And because of this, I never really identified myself with this place in any meaningful way. However, Minnesota was the place where my mom got a job at Northwest Airlines, which was a major airline headquartered 15 minutes away from our home. When she started working for Northwest in the 1990s, my entire family got flight benefits, and we absolutely abused them and used this really great privilege to leave Minnesota often, to the point that I never felt grounded in Minnesota or anywhere else for that matter. We returned to California to see family on a regular basis. We visited Hawaii relatively often. We traveled to different places around the world, including trips to the Philippines, and I was even able to I was even able to visit my absolute favorite place in the world as a young adult, which was Japan, a place I gravitated towards because of my love of anime and otaku culture. So this is actually a picture of me in high school. I actually had to think a second about whether or not I wanted to show this to everybody, but I thought might as well. Um, but in any case, when I graduated, and actually, so this picture, this wasn't my first time in Japan. This is me going to Japan in high school as like this sort of exchange trip. Where I used my flight benefits to kind of go and participate. And so this is me and one of my friends from high school visiting Kiyomizu-dera in Kyoto. But in case, When I graduated high school and left for college, I went to Washington D.C., and it was able to go there because of these flight benefits. When I graduated in 2010, I graduated with my undergraduate degree in Asian Studies and Japanese language and literature. Because my university didn't have a Tagalog or an Asian American Studies program at that time, unfortunately. But I ended up writing my undergraduate thesis on travel writing in Japanese literature. My interest in Okinawa started at the University of Hawaii at Manoa when I was an MA student, where I first learned about colonization, post-colonial theory, as well as Native Hawaiian and other indigenous responses to U.S. empire, and the ways that histories of colonization connect many of our islands in the Pacific together. I was actually just kind of further, in preparing for this talk, I was just kind of going through and seeing if I can find any sort of like relevant like pictures for this talk. And so I bumped into like part of a newsletter from my alma mater in Washington, D.C. But it was talking about a paper that I gave for a graduate student conference at the University of Hawaii. And so this sort of paper looked at a Japanese travel writer and the ways in which they depict the Philippines in their work, and how this Japanese travel writer really kind of uh, reproduced sort of this colonial relationship that they have with the Philippines. And so this was kind of a time in my life where these sort of ideas were sort of percolating in my head. In any case, I became invested in the struggles of Okinawa in particular in relation to the Philippines because of my intellectual engagements in the context of Hawaii, thinking alongside other Okinawan studies scholars, friends, and mentors. And so this is a picture of me when I was at the University of Hawaii. The person in the middle is Oshiro Tatsuhiro, or the late Oshiro Tatsuhiro, who is this really great Okinawan intellectual who won Japan's biggest literary award in the 1960s, but spent much of his life, writing about the U.S. occupation of Okinawa, and as well as Okinawa's colonial relationship with Japan. And so this is a person that I was able to meet because I was in Hawaii around this time. And actually, Oshiro Tatsuhiro has also been very helpful with my research. He's the person who kind of put me in touch with one Okinawan author in particular, who I'll talk about towards the end of my talk today. Um, oh, and then the person on the far right is Bob Huey, who is my MA advisor. He does uh, like classical Japanese literature, but he was a big advocate for Okinawan studies, and really kind of helped direct my research towards and putting me in contact with Okinawan like scholars in Hawaii, but also in Okinawa. But in any case, being at the University of Hawaii was a transformative experience for me, as it was the first time that I saw myself as part of a larger Pacific community, and not just a lifelong temporary visitor mindlessly consuming other cultures through the tourism industry. Learning to be a part of a Pacific community for me entailed being accountable to each other, where I began to think about my own proximity to settler colonialism in Hawaii and other places around the world where I traveled. Um, it was also around this time, being at UH, that I began to think critically about my love for Japanese popular culture and the ways that popular forms that I grew up with, like anime, not only hide Japan's wartime and colonial history in the Philippines, which I previously wasn't aware of, but also the circumstances that continue to marginalize Okinawans today and the roles that Filipinos play in this context. In fact, it was only while doing this research on Okinawa and traveling there throughout the years that I learned about my own family members who served in the US military in Okinawa, who, before I became an academic, just told me that they were stationed in Japan. Which reproduces the logic of the settler colonialism in Okinawa through the sort of like naturalization of Okinawa as being part of Japan, where we know that Okinawa was an independent kingdom prior to Japanese colonization. So The reason why I'm sharing all of this about myself with you this afternoon is because Island Under the Sun is in many ways a culmination of my journey in recognizing my responsibility to this place as a Filipino American scholar, which is to use what I've learned to make Okinawa legible to my community. So to all of you. I teach a lot of Filipino undergraduate students here at Cal Poly. And so part of the inspiration of this project is trying to get students, scholars, and slash or general readers who may or may never go to this place to care about Okinawa through travel writing as a particular genre that teaches readers about places that might not seem relevant at first glance. For me, I think Filipinos should care about Okinawa in the same way we care about Hawaii, especially given the history of Filipinos there, but also because of our proximity to the United States and US militarization and the damage that it does on these lands. One of the questions that I often get by people in Okinawa and elsewhere is, why am I studying this place? And my answer is usually this. In my journeys as a temporary visitor, student, and intellectual learning about Okinawa, I've come to learn a lot about resistance and resurgence from a context different from my own, from scholars, mentors, and friends who I met along the way, who helped me to see the world differently. The goal of my project is to share what I've learned. And what I've learned is that engaging the complicated histories between the Philippines and Okinawa can help us to imagine new forms of community that don't exist quite yet. So, the first stop in my narrative is a place that I visited called the Davao Memorial Stone, located on Mabuni Hill in Itoman City in Okinawa's southern region. Mabuni Hill is located in the Okinawa Peace Prayer Park, which is the geographical site where the Battle of Okinawa ended. The Davao Memorial, which stands on this hill, was built in 1945 by money donated by former Okinawan settlers in the Philippines who, before World War II, lived in Davao, located in the southern Philippine region of Mindanao. So I won't get too much. I won't get into it too much here. But the historian Eric Hitada writes that Davao, in the pre-World War II period, was a multi-layered site of settler colonialism. In the pre-World War II period, where both the US and Japan developed their settler colonial projects in Mindanao at the same time, with the influx of Japanese, including Okinawan settlers, as well as settlers coming from other parts of the Philippines. But in any case, in the context of like Okinawan settlers coming to Mindanao, that after the war, they were repatriated back to Okinawa and built this monument in 1972 to mourn the 1,115 Okinawans who died during the war. As the Okinawan literary scholar Nakahoro Masanori has argued, the Battle of Okinawa was one of the most traumatic events in Okinawa's history. And while the war in the Philippines was similar in the sense it was also a horrific experience that many Okinawans went through, it carried the additional burden of being experienced in a foreign country. And so this is to say that that I think that Nakahoro Masanori was sort of talking about. It's like this sort of added tragedy of dying away from your homeland. Narratives about this particular war experience in the Philippines can be found throughout Okinawa in autobiographies as well as newspaper articles that can still be found today. The Okinawan author Sakiyama Asao wrote about the lingering effects of this experience in his short story, Davao Pilgrimage, which won an important literary award in Okinawa in 1997. This is a work that I translated, wrote about, and still return to as part of this ongoing project, especially given that this is one of the only works of Okinawan fiction that I've been able to find that explores the relations between Okinawan and Filipino people. So this story takes place in the 1990s and is about two Okinawan men who travel to Davao to participate in a pilgrimage tour based on a real Okinawan pilgrimage that takes place in the Philippines every year, carried out by the same group who constructed the Davao Memorial Stone. So in this story, Sakiyama's narrative remembers the diasporic history of Okinawan settlers who migrated to the Philippines in the first decades of the 20th century and their wartime experiences. This history serves as a backdrop of the story, since the main concern of Sakayama's narrative is not the war itself, but rather how trauma of this war experience informs the uneven relations between the Okinawan characters and the Filipinos that they meet on this trip. One aspect of the story that I think is significant here is the physical description of one of the characters who is described as being bow-legged. This character, whose name is Haruo, was an Okinawan settler in Davao during the pre-World War II period and became bow-legged because of his experience in the war as a child. In the context of this narrative, Haruo's bow-leggedness represents his trauma from the war, but also his fraught position of being Okinawan and a Japanese subject at the same time, which manifests itself in the unequal relations between the Okinawan and Filipino characters. In the context of the story and from the perspective of the Filipinos that they meet, the Okinawan character's use of the N in the Philippines makes it so that the Okinawan characters might as well be Japanese. So this can be seen when the Okinawan characters hire Filipino interpreters to translate the local language into Japanese for them, when they hire Filipino drivers to go wherever they want in the Philippines, and even when they go into the red light district in the story, which is a direct reference to the participation of Japanese men in sex tourism in Southeast Asia around this time. So the word bow-legged that I just mentioned is relevant here because bow-legged in Japanese is ganimata, and mata in the word ganimata for bow-legged means split or forked, such as a forked road. The meaning of forked or split speaks to the marginalized status of Okinawans by Japanese colonialism on one hand, but also the privileges that Okinawan characters have in the Philippines because of this context. Furthermore, ganimata or bow-legged also translates into Tagalog as sakang, which is a derogatory word that Filipinos historically referred to Japanese during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines during World War II, due to the way that Japanese soldiers would walk in their boots. That sakang or bow-leggedness can be used to describe the Okinawan character of Haruo, produces a double effect that at once erases his Okinawan identity but also situates him in the position of being Japanese in the story, even though he himself is a colonized person coming from a context of occupation. So, I spent a lot of time thinking about this story actually, and wondering why Sakayama even decided to write this narrative and depict the unequal relations between Okinawan and Filipino people this way. When I visited this memorial on the land where the Battle of Okinawa ended, things for me became a little bit more clear. While Davao Pilgrimage is a fictitious work, its exploration of Okinawan and Filipino relations makes it resonate with actual pilgrimages that are carried out by Okinawans in other places in the Pacific today. As the Okinawan diaspora studies scholar Edith Kaneshiro notes, pilgrimages by Okinawans in the context of Micronesia have embraced efforts to include Micronesians in their memorial practices, which differ from pilgrimages by Japanese tourists in the region. Oops. So, Kaneshiro argues that the inclusion of Micronesians in Okinawan pilgrimages is significant as it serves as a form of remembrance that works against the forms of remembering in Japan that only glorify the country's imperial past. Considering this, I understand Sakayama's work as a way of not only remembering the Okinawan war dead in the Philippines, but also meditating on the ways that settler colonialism, war, and militarization has brought Okinawans and Filipinos into contact with each other, which to me invites Filipinos everywhere to be a part of this conversation. So when I stepped near the memorial stone to pay my own respects to those who died in Davao, a large white butterfly drifted by me, stopping me in my tracks. It was the Ogo Madara, the prefectural butterfly. I asked the woman working at this park about this insect in Japanese, and in response, she kindly handed me an English brochure. This brochure said that this butterfly is a symbol of peace, who mourns the dead and welcomes people who visit this place. When I read that, I immediately recalled a Filipino superstition that if a moth or butterfly visits you, it is actually an ancestor making themselves known. A lot of people, not just Filipinos, of course, participate in the island's tourism industry to enjoy the beaches eat the food, and perhaps for those coming from other parts of Asia to experience a version of American culture without having to cross the Pacific Ocean. But being Filipino American in these lands, when visiting a place like this and engaging with Sakayama's work, invites me to become a different kind of visitor, even as I'm participating in the tourism industry. I thought about this for a while. I thought about the larger histories that link Okinawa and the Philippines together, and continued on my way. Thank you so much, everybody. And I look forward to any questions that you have.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Ryan. I'm going to give folks a moment to integrate and process,
Yeah.
integrate, and then give them a chance. We don't have a whole lot of time
Yeah.
Q&A, but if folks do have questions that please post them to the chat. Even if Ryan is not able to address them all now, I will be sure to forward them to Ryan for consideration, especially as he continues to work on his book. So I think I have a question for you,
Yes,
Ryan.
absolutely.
I think one question I have in the time that we have um, is, just of course your book manuscript is really looking at is sort of approaching Filipinos in Okinawa from the sort of from the framework of detouring, right? Sort
Yeah.
of. So then I wonder, because it does come up, and we do know there's a critical mass of Filipino migrant workers there as well. And what does it look like, right? What are for you to circulate kind of in the space of Okinawa as in the mode of detouring, as opposed to being a labor migrant? How do these different kinds of travels and to some extent settlement open up and limit possibilities for kind of Filipino Okinawa solidarity?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful question. And I'm sorry, I'm turning off like my sound. I'm going through allergies. It's like it's really bad this year, so I really apologize. But I think, but and I think that's such a really wonderful question because it really points to the heterogeneity of like the Filipino like diaspora and like the reasons why people go to different places. And so the reason why I use the analytic or I prioritize the analytic of detours is because it really speaks to my own like relationality to Okinawa. Because I think to your point, it's like I'm not like a laborer there. Like I'm there because of course, through the university, through research, but primarily it's because I'm there through like the tourism, through the tourism industry. And so I think it sort of like acknowledges like my own positionality and me trying to sort of grapple with that. I do think too that even when we sort of like extend it to Filipinos who do work as laborers, within the context of within the context of the U.S. military, is that I think it's sort of also like it's a completely different experience than my own. But at the very same time, it's because of our proximity to U.S. empire, particularly in the context of Okinawa, that makes us all sort of complicit. Like I actually tell my students, I tell this when we talk about Hawaii in my classes, but I also extend this in Okinawa, is that it actually really doesn't matter whether or not you go or you don't go. We're already complicit because of our proximity to the United States. And so regardless of what is your specific kind of positionality in these sort of places, at the end of the day, we have to sort of at least engage the question of empire. And I think this is the sort of conversation that I'm trying to kind of get at. And I think as it stands right now, Filipinx and Okinawan solidarity is not sort of it's a completely different sort of situation that we have in Hawaii, where I think in Filipinx studies, we see, Hawaii as like a major site of the Filipinx diaspora. There's a lot of us who stand in solidarity with Native Hawaiian movements for sovereignty. But I think part of like my sort of intervention here is that given that Filipinos are all over the world, we have to sort of kind of grapple with other indigenous contexts, right? And then I think for me, it's not a case where it's like I have family there for multiple generations, where we're kind of like settlers in this particular way, but Filipinos still participate in the logics of settler colonialism when we consider it to be like these sort of processes that have to continuously deny Okinawans from their lands and waters. And that because we are, Filipinos and have our own particular kinds of histories, like this is the sort of limitation, but also the possibilities in sort of thinking in other ways. And I think the analytic of detour, the form of travel writing, is sort of a way to make these sort of conversations, at least for me, like a little bit more friendlier to like undergraduate students who I teach, and hopefully to general readers.
Yeah, no, this is actually really, really interesting and compelling, especially when you think about so much of what accounts, you know, very our globality as a global migrant force is so deeply implicated in U.S. empire and a kind of the globalization of U.S. corporations, right? And so I think this how you're inviting us to consider all of the myriad ways that we are complicit in our being as sort of neo-colonial subjects, but also
Mhm.
kind of in the ways we may or may not, just that, regardless of travel, is actually very, very interesting because it does require a consideration for all Filipinx people because everywhere from Palestine to
Yeah.
Okinawa, Guam, so many places. We are also, we travel alongside, right? Kind of the military and corporations and kind of considering what that all means in terms of how our the complexity of our own entanglements with settler colonialism. So thank you for that. No, we don't have too much time, but there are two questions in the chat
Oh, yes.
just for you to maybe ponder. I don't know that we have time to kind of process the questions together collectively here, unless you have something you want to kind of a response that you have in the last minute or so.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm just gonna like really read quickly these questions. So, okay, so Anna Pack.
And in the meantime, go ahead and read those.
Oh,
And
yes.
meanwhile, I will just do a plug to just remind folks, just as always, the Bulasan Center, when we were the Bulasan Center, started as a grassroots fundraising effort, and we still have to, um, source our funds from somewhere. So if you like this kind of programming, please consider donating to Marokaya. We are hustling very hard to secure funding so we can continue to do this work. And if you like it, please support us. But maybe that give you a little bit of time as I did that plug, Ryan, to kind of maybe pick a question to respond to in the last maybe minute or so.
Yeah, so absolutely. So I think so Joy, so hi Joy, thank you so much for coming. Um so yeah, so what I think is like kind of like interesting, and I wanted to, and the reason why I'm addressing, I think Joy's question first is because I think this is kind of a continuation of what you were sort of talking about, Robin, where it's like I think when we sort of engage like Okinawa, we're actually dealing with overlapping forms of colonialism, not just US empire, but also Japanese imperialism. And so it's not like a question of like, Asian like the sort of traditional like Filipinx slash Asian American sort of framework of Asian settler colonialism in which there's like a binary. This sort of like entanglement between the Philippines and Okinawa go actually quite further. And so you actually have a case where Okinawans were also settlers like in the Philippines. And this is a thing that Okinawans also sort of talk about, particularly in this sort of work that I was sort of that I tried to introduce. And I think for me, the point is that I think Okinawans are, really talking with each other, like the ways in which about their own complicities in this sort of colonial violence against other people. And so I'm kind of taking their cue and sort of kind of thinking about that in terms of like, what does it mean to be Filipino American, engaging these sort of conversations, but then also looking at the ways in which we are also complicit in these sort of forms of violence, like to other people. And so it's kind of this sort of multi-directional sort of thing. But yes, it's like I think to Joy's point, there's other like Filipinx. I mean, there's other like Filipino, like Philippine studies scholars who too talk about, settler colonialism, like in Mindanao. Eric Kitada just came out with a really great piece that I referenced. It's in settler colonial studies, and she talks about, you know, the influx of Japanese settlers as well as settlers from the other parts of the Philippines going into Davao. And so in terms of Rafi's point, indigenous, like Okinawan groups, collectivities, movements, or conversations are present on the land and waters there. Yeah, I think it really just depends on who you talk to, just like everybody, you know, just like every other like sort of group. It's like the question is like, can the subaltern speak? It's like, yes, but not necessarily with one voice, right? And I think that you have to kind of, and I think the folks that I've been sort of kind of in dialogue, which are like, you know, my friends, but also colleagues that I went to the University of Hawaii with, you know, I think I I'm constant, like I'm very attentive of not trying to like say that I am like an expert of Okinawan studies, but rather being very transparent and saying that I am like a Filipino studies scholar who's in dialogue with the scholars in Okinawa, and then sort of trying to bring this sort of conversation to what we're sort of talking about like in the field. And I think yeah, and so it's a more about like sort of recognizing my own sort of like responsibility and like what do you do with this knowledge, you know, once you start learning it. Um, yeah, sorry, Rafi, I don't have very great questions. In terms of like collectives, I mean, I think there are various like transnational like women's like networks against militarization. I mean, this is a really wonderful place to start. I mean, even I think looking at some of the ways in which like I'm sort of framing my project really kind of follows sort of the model that, you know, feminist scholars and activists that are doing on the ground.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Actually, I could just put just one link. There is a coalition of organizations in the Asia Pacific that kind of look at kind of the politics of aid in Asia, and the ways in which kind of aid from the US, Japan, and other kind of multilateral institutions is always militarized. So I just put that link there, the reality of aid .org link. And when you see kind of the about and the members, you can see the range of organizations throughout the Asia Pacific that are likely addressing questions of militarization, among other things, in case that's of interest. And that's maybe for you, Rafi. And I know we went a little bit over time, but we also started just a little over time. So thank you to everybody who was able to um, to 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 stay on. And again, the recordings for this talk and all previous talks are online. And so please go there for any of those resources. We always like to come up with a resource kind of list after a talk. So I'll follow up with you, Ryan, for slides. And then we can kind of put that together for folks who participate. Also, that we have lots of people who RSVP'd for this lecture series in general who like to keep track. And yeah, again, you know, programming like this, I sound like, you know, public radio, like a pitch, but you know, programming like this is only possible through the generous support of viewers like you. So please support. We want to continue to have these kinds of conversations. You know, part of what we love about not being at the university is that we can you know, kind of introduce different kinds of topics, put very interesting sets of people together, as with this lecture series where we drew lots of different types of people together who maybe ordinarily wouldn't be put into conversation with one another. And we hope to continue to grow this work. So thank you all for attending. Thank you so much, Dr. Buyco.
Well,
And
thank you so much,
I
everyone.
will be in touch in the future to continue to talk through the book project so we can see it in our hands soon.
Awesome.
Again, take care, everybody, and enjoy. Well, this is the end of this particular program, but hopefully we have something to announce in the coming months for future programming on this topic. Okay, take care now. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.